Step inside the glittering halls of medieval England, where golden chandeliers and polished marble floors reflected not just wealth, but the crushing weight of secrets too heavy for one so young to carry. History remembers kings and queens draped in luxury, their portraits forever painted as symbols of majesty and power. But what the portraits never tell you is the story of a girl barely at the threshold of adolescence, chosen not for her happiness, but for the survival of a dynasty. She was only 13 years old, when most children dream of games and freedom. She was handpicked to become the mother of England's future king. Imagine the silence of her chambers. Walls draped with silken curtains, candles flickering. Against ancient stone, a child's laughter should have filled that room. But instead, there was only the weight of expectation. Her name would one day be written in the annals of history, but not as an innocent child, rather as a queen, as a mother, as a symbol of royal duty. She was asked to give up her childhood overnight. She was asked to carry a crown on her head and a burden in her womb, all before she could even understand what love, choice, or freedom truly meant. For the men of the court, this was not strange. It was politics. It was tradition. It was the price of power. But for her, it was something else. Every golden thread sewn into her gown felt like a chain. Every jewel gifted to her was not a treasure, but a reminder that she no longer belonged to herself. She belonged to history, to the kingdom, to the will of men who saw her not as a girl, but as a vessel for their legacy. And yet, history silenced her voice. In the portraits we see today, she appears radiant, draped in silk and lace, crowned with pearls and gold. Behind those carefully painted eyes was melancholy. Behind that lowered gaze was a storm of fear, confusion, and the crushing realization that she had no way out. The palace for her was not a home, it was a prison. Wrapped in velvet, this was not love. This was not choice. This was duty. A duty sealed by ancient laws, cloaked in the language of honor, and enforced by the silent obedience expected of every woman in her position. But she was not every woman. She was a girl forced to carry a dynasty before she even carried her own name into adulthood, and this duty would mark her forever. Think about this. How many stories like hers were erased? How many royal women we celebrate today as queens and mothers were once young girls stripped of their innocence in the name of tradition? We glorify the crowns, the jewels, the royal palaces, but at what cost? Behind every crown there is a scar. Behind every golden throne, there is a story of sacrifice. And in her story, the sacrifice was childhood itself. As we peel back the layers of history, we find not just a tale of one queen, but a chilling reminder of how power was built on silence. The silence of young voices forced into roles they never chose. The silence of women buried under crowns too heavy for their fragile heads. And in that silence, an entire kingdom was built, a kingdom that remembers its kings, but forgets the pain of its queens. So when we speak of England's future king, let us not forget the girl who bore him, not the radiant queen painted in oils centuries ago, but the child behind the crown, the child whose story was written not in her own words, but in the will of others. Her tragedy was not just her onnet, was the tragedy of a system that valued lineage over life and power over innocence. And it began here, in these palace walls, where gold and glory masked a secret too dark to ignore. Behind the palace gates, the truth was far darker than the dazzling jewels and rich feasts that history celebrates. For the girl chosen to bear the crown's future, life was not filled with freedom or laughter. It was ruled by watchful eyes and suffocating expectations. Every step she took was monitored, every word she spoke was measured. She could not run in the gardens like other children her age. She could not laugh openly without being judged. Her body was no longer her own. It was seen as the kingdom's greatest asset, a vessel for the royal bloodline. Imagine the pressure. 13 years old, dressed in gowns heavy with gold and lace, while grown men whispered about her duty in council chambers. The palace walls echoed not with her voice, but with the voices of men who decided her fate without asking her. She was praised in public as a symbol of virtue, but behind closed doors she carried a silent fear that she dared not speak aloud. Her childhood had ended, yet she had no choice in the matter. She had been transformed into a queen before she could even understand what it meant to be a woman. This wasn't a fairy tale. It was a bargain of power where innocence was sacrificed. On the altar of ambition, though history tells us of kings who conquered lands and ruled empires, it rarely tells us of the young queens whose tears built those thrones. Her smile in the painted portraits may seem calm, but it was the calm of someone who had no voice, no freedom, and no way out. This was the tragedy of her life, a tragedy wrapped in silk and crowned with gold. The deeper you look inside the palace, the clearer it becomes. This was not a home, it was a stage. And she, still a child in years, was forced into the role of a queen. Every gathering of nobles, every feast, every council meeting was another reminder that her future was already written, not by her hands, but by the kingdom's hunger for power. At 13, her voice carried no weight in decisions, but her body carried the entire burden of a dynasty's survival. She was celebrated publicly, yet she lived privately in silence. It was not joy they expected from her, it was obedience. Imagine sitting in a banquet hall filled with laughter, music, and wine, while knowing that everyone around you sees you not as a girl, not even as a queen, but only as the mother of a future heir. The crown was not a prize on her head, it was a chain. She wore gowns made of silk, jewels that sparkled brighter than stars, yet none of it could hide the truth that she was still a prisoner of tradition. Her smile was painted on her face, but her eyes betrayed her heart, a storm of fear, confusion, and loneliness. This is where history feels cruel. The very paintings we admire in museums, the very stories told about the birth of kings, rarely mention the suffering that made them possible. She was not remembered for her laughter, her dreams, or her voice only for the child she carried. And so, while England looked forward to its future king, no one stopped to ask what was lost in the making of that story. What was stolen from her youth? What can never be returned? Behind the grandeur of gold and silk, the palace was a cage. Every night, as the corridors fell silent, the weight of her reality grew heavier. She was only 13, yet expected to think, act, and endure as a queen. Her heart longed for freedom, for laughter, for the innocence of childhood, but those things had been stolen from her. In their place came loneliness, endless silence, and the crushing pressure of expectations. She was never asked what she wanted. No one cared if she was afraid. To the world, she was a queen in the making. But to herself, she was a prisoner of duty, a child forced to grow too soon. And while the kingdom celebrated the promise of a future king, she endured a private tragedy, one that history rarely dares to tell. History remembers the crown, the king, and the dynasty that followed. But it rarely remembers her, the child who was forced into a queen's role far too soon. Her story is not written in victories or conquests, but in silent suffering and stolen years. The portraits show her in gold and jewels, but they cannot show the tears shed behind closed doors. She carried the future of England, but no one carried her pain. Her life reminds us that, behind every throne, behind every celebrated king, there is often a forgotten woman sacrificed for power, erased by time, remembered only in whispers. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: her tragedy was not unique. She was one of many, silenced by history. Yet her story still echoes, begging us to listen, to remember, and never forget the cost of crowns.